At first, it didn't look like anything, but when long-time MH370 investigator Jean-Luc Marchand looked closer, something didn't add up, because at the exact moment MH370 disappeared from the radar, something that should have been there wasn't. For years, investigators assumed it was one flip, one moment, and Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished on March 8, 2014. 239 people gone. But what Marchand recently found in the data tells a different story. And the thing is, the data had been sitting there the whole time. The first thing that stood out was the transponder, because it didn't just switch off. It was stepped down, one setting at a time. That's what Marchand and his team saw when they finally went through something called the CAPTION dataset. That's raw air traffic control radar recordings from Malaysia, basically a detailed record of where the aircraft was and how it was moving. Somehow, it had never been properly analyzed before. It was there in 2014. It just hadn't been examined this closely. Marchand has spent 9 years dissecting this case alongside former commercial pilot Captain Patrick Blelly, who has been investigating it since 2014. But this discovery was different, because on a Boeing 777, the transponder isn't a simple on-off switch. It's a rotating knob with 5 distinct positions, ranging from full traffic alert and advisory mode, which warns pilots about nearby aircraft, all the way down to standby. And you don't jump straight to off. You move through those positions step by step. That's exactly what the data shows happened here. Whoever was at the control didn't slam it to standby in a panic. They deliberately moved through each position, including a stop at the no altitude setting, where the transponder continues transmitting but hides its altitude, before finally going dark on standby. That's not a malfunction or a sudden emergency. That's someone who knew what they were doing. At this exact moment, another system was recording the forces being applied to the aircraft's control column. That's the wheel the pilots used to steer the plane. But there was nothing, no force inputs whatsoever. The autopilot was holding the aircraft steady, and nobody was touching the controls. No struggle, no resistance, no sign that anyone was trying to stop what was happening. That tells you the cockpit was calm. Nobody was fighting for control, and it strongly suggests there was only one person in that cockpit at that moment, because if there had been two, the data would almost certainly show some kind of physical reaction. A push, a pull, some indication that the pilot or a co-pilot noticed something wrong and tried to intervene. But there was nothing. So now you have a deliberate manual act, carried out calmly, at the exact second the aircraft reached waypoint IGARI, the last scheduled checkpoint in Malaysian airspace. That timing isn't random. According to Marchand, whoever did this was watching the display. The moment the aircraft symbol touched that waypoint, that's when they acted. That level of precision matters, because the next thing Marchand found is all about precision too, and how it suddenly disappears. From takeoff in Kuala Lumpur to waypoint IGARI, the CAPTION data shows MH370 flying with near-perfect accuracy. Exactly what you'd expect from an aircraft on autopilot, holding a locked heading. The Boeing 777 can stay within about 0.1 nautical miles of its course, and that's exactly what it did. Then, the U-turn happens, and everything changes. After MH370 turned back toward the Strait of Malacca, the path starts to drift. Not wildly, but just enough. Instead of those clean, perfectly straight lines, the trajectory shows a series of heading changes and slight oscillations, the kind of movement you only get when someone is flying manually. When Marchand's team filtered out the data, what remained was a path flown in segments at roughly 0.2 nautical miles of precision. Still precise, but not machine perfect. And that difference matters, because after the diversion, the aircraft makes at least 5 distinct turns, none of them aligning with standard navigation waypoints. Autopilots don't deviate from a programmed route without a pilot actively reprogramming them. This wasn't a ghost flight cruising on autopilot to its doom. Someone was flying this aircraft and making a decision in real time. There's one more detail, something the CAPTION data rules out entirely. For years, people had been wondering about whether an onboard explosion, a fire, or some kind of catastrophic system failure could explain the disappearance. Because during the period when MH370 was turning back toward Malaysia, there was another aircraft in the area, a small medical cargo flight carrying organs and emergency supplies. It was more than 100 nautical miles away, but at that altitude, on a clear night, any kind of explosion or fire on board MH370 would have been visible. That aircraft didn't report anything. No flash, no debris, no distress call, which means whatever was happening on MH370 that night wasn't sudden. It was controlled and silent to the outside world. Keep that in mind, because there's this other aircraft, the one that changes how you look at this. As MH370 flew back across the Strait of Malacca, near Penang, it passed close to another aircraft, Emirates Flight UAE 343, climbing through the same airspace toward cruise altitude, about 30 nautical miles apart. That's close, especially in the dead of night, with MH370's transponder and TCAS system switched off. And MH370 wouldn't have received any alert about Emirates. Both aircraft were essentially invisible to each other. According to Marchand, whoever was flying MH370 likely saw the Emirates aircraft visually and made a decision not to climb over it, but to fly below. Why below? Because below is harder to spot at night, and staying under the established air route keeps you out of the main traffic layer. And it also lines up with another piece of evidence. A signal from the co-pilot's phone, picked up by a Penang cell tower. This suggests the aircraft couldn't have been higher than roughly 32,000 feet at that point. In other words, it had already come down, deliberately, and the Emirates encounter helps explain this. There's another detail that stands out when you look at all of this together. Leaked flight documents revealed that MH370's cockpit oxygen supply was topped up the day before departure, even though there was already enough for the flight to Beijing. That detail might sound routine, but placed alongside everything else, it starts to look different. Because if the cabin had been depressurized mid-flight manually by the pilot, passenger emergency oxygen masks would have lasted roughly 20 minutes. A fully replenished cockpit supply, on the other hand, can sustain a pilot for hours. That doesn't prove intent on its own, but it does fit a pattern. Someone planning ahead, and it lines up with everything else the data shows. Controlled actions, deliberate timing, and decisions made in real time. There's one more detail that tends to get overlooked. At some point during the flight, the aircraft's electrical systems were shut down and then partially restored. When MH370 reconnected to the Inmarsat satellite network with that now famous series of hourly pings, something was missing. The flight identifier. The digital tag that should have transmitted automatically wasn't there. That doesn't usually disappear on its own. Resetting it means going into the flight management computer and manually clearing it. That's something you wouldn't even know how to find unless you know the system, which suggests someone with experience knew what it would transmit and chose to suppress it. The transponder knob cycled step by step, no force on the controls. The precision of the early autopilot path versus the manual flight path that followed. No sign of any explosion or sudden failure. A near miss with Emirates. A descent that lines up with external signals. The preloaded cockpit oxygen. The flight identifier that doesn't come back when the power does. For years, these kinds of details pointed in different directions. But now they don't. They all point the same way. According to Marchand, that's the most surprising discovery of all. Not a new clue, but the fact that none of these details contradict each other. When the CAPTION dataset is combined with the geoscience data from Geoscience Australia, the results don't conflict. They reinforce each other. And for a case that spent a decade generating competing theories, That kind of data agreement changes how we look at everything. Which brings us to the search. The marine robotics company leading it, Ocean Infinity, returned to the southern Indian Ocean after its earlier attempt in 2018. This time under a no-find, no-fee agreement with the Malaysian government, worth up to $70 million. The search ran in 2 phases across 2025 and early 2026. By March 8, 2026, Ocean Infinity had covered over 140,000 square kilometers of seabed and still hadn't found the aircraft. But that doesn't mean the trail has gone cold. The technology being used, autonomous underwater vehicles, is extraordinarily capable. The challenge is the environment. At around 5,000 meters deep, the terrain is anything but flat, valleys, ridges, and sheer underwater mountains, places where wreckage can easily go unseen. And according to Marchand and Blelly, there's another factor. They believe Ocean Infinity did not fully search the specific zone their trajectory reconstruction recommends. Specifically, the western portion of that area remains unsearched, which means the most likely location may still be out there. The families are still pushing. Groups like Voice 370, representing surviving family members, have urged Malaysia not to abandon the search. They point out that under the current agreement, no payment is owed unless the plane is found. Ocean Infinity hopes to return when conditions allow it, but time matters here. And so does what happens if the aircraft is finally located. Because finding it wouldn't just end the search, but it would change everything about the investigation. Marchand is very specific about this. The tail section of a Boeing 777 is built to withstand enormous structural strength. That's where the black boxes sit. At these depths, with stable water temperatures and salinity levels, there's a real chance the flight recorders could still be intact and readable. Once found, the flight data recorder would give investigators every parameter of the flight, every heading change, every altitude deviation, every engine input. The cockpit voice recorder would capture the final 2 hours of whatever was said, whatever alarms sounded, whatever was happening in that cockpit in those last moments above the southern Indian Ocean. But none of that matters if the site isn't handled properly, because it wouldn't be just a wreckage, it would be a crime scene. Uncontrolled access, divers pulling up debris and any disturbance of the wreckage before proper forensic documentation, all of it risks erasing the very answers investigators have been searching for, which explains why the Malaysian government has been so cautious in how it communicates. You don't announce a crime scene before you've secured it. What we know so far points in one direction. The aircraft flew for 7 hours and 37 minutes on fuel loaded for a 7-hour, 31-minute journey. Every indicator from the satellite pings to the drift analysis of debris recovered off the coast of Africa and the islands of the Indian Ocean points to a final resting place in the southern Indian Ocean. And the newer data strengthens that picture. More than ever, it strongly suggests the aircraft was being flown deliberately by someone who knew exactly what they were doing all the way to the end. What the data can't tell us is who. But if the wreckage is found, that may finally change. The positions of the oxygen masks, the state of the cockpit door, whatever the voice recorder captured in those final 2 hours, 12 years of unanswered questions, sitting in the dark, 5,000 meters down, waiting to be found.